production of nearly 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, 70,000 warships, 20 million rifles, and 41 billion bullets to use in them. And if you think that meant that almost no non-military goods were being produced, well, think again. Amazingly, at no time during the war did war production account for more than 40% of the gross national product. With millions of men joining the armed forces, women became a large part of the nation's working force. Soldiers without guns, the posters called them, and before 1942 was even half over, more than 750,000 women had volunteered for defense work.
All the day long, where the rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, when they gave her a production knee, she was as proud as a girl could be. There's something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie, the riveter.
But at first, they were not all that welcome. Officials at several factories complained that the women often wore tight sweaters and flirted with the male workers. At Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, a dark underground bomb shelter was sealed off because several couples were using it as a tunnel of love during lunch hours. But as the months went on, the prejudice against women workers began to fade. As Time magazine somewhat condescendingly wrote in its September 14th issue, when women are good, they are better than men. They are nimbler with their fingers, don't fret or get bored with repetitious work, they're generally quicker, and are particularly good in assembling small parts. As the war went on, however, it became evident that women were clearly holding their own in the phenomenal production effort that was probably even more critical than the atomic bomb in shortening the war and saving lives.
Rosie, 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 the riveter, on the assembly line.
The atomic bomb, of course, was another amazing chapter in the story of America's wartime production. Workmen in 1942 began clearing the land near the remote town of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for a purpose that none of them could even imagine. When one worker was asked, "What are you making here?" he replied, $1.35 an hour. In reality, it was the beginning of a plant to produce uranium-235, the A-bomb's key ingredient. Germany had a huge head start in the making of an atomic bomb. Most American experts felt that the only way the Allies could lose the war would be if Hitler beat us to the bomb. And in 1942, there was serious doubt that we could catch up in time. To have even a chance of doing so, America needed 3 tons of U-235 by the end of 1942. At the beginning of the year, our total output was 8 ounces a day. A team of top scientists, headed by Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, was called upon to meet the nation's greatest production challenge, and it was met. By November, production of U-235 had reached 500 pounds a day, and the 3 tons were delivered. A month later, on November 2nd, 1942, the uranium was put to use, and the atomic age had begun. Working in an ultra-secret laboratory beneath the stands of an unused football stadium at the University of Chicago, scientists accomplished the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in history. It proved that an atomic bomb was possible and that we could build one before the Nazis. But the A-bomb was still years away, and the war still had to be fought by men with guns and tanks and planes. And the first thing they had to do was to learn how to be soldiers or sailors or Marines. It was no easy task. That was seen to by someone called a first sergeant or drill instructor. These were men who stood 10 feet tall, weighed 400 pounds, and used their voices to shatter bulletproof glass. A friend away from home.
This is the Army, Mr. Jones. No private rooms or telephone. You had your breakfast in bed before, but you won't have it there anymore.
This is the Army, Mr. Brown. You and your baby went to town. She had you worried, but this is war, and she won't worry you anymore.
When the ordeal was over, you were officially a GI, standing for government issue. The standard procedure was for the new GI to get a few days' leave, presumably to go home for a tense reunion with family and friends.
Stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas. The prairie sky is wide and high, deep in the heart of Texas.
Obviously, every GI didn't go home to Texas. It just seemed that way. The song Deep in the Heart of Texas was heard so often in 1942 that more than one soldier expressed the hope that his first combat assignment would be an attack on the Alamo. Fortunately, other targets had higher priorities. In the Philippines, those first months of 1942, the Japanese were advancing steadily against the outnumbered and undersupplied American defenders. We had plenty of equipment at home, but Japan controlled the air and sea. There was no way to deliver it. Finally, the American forces were driven to a small peninsula south of Manila known as Bataan. The situation was hopeless. On March 11th, President Roosevelt ordered the American commander, General Douglas MacArthur, to be evacuated by a PT boat that sneaked through the Japanese fleet at night. As he left, MacArthur vowed, "I shall return." The rest of the American force, 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers, were forced to surrender less than a month later. It was the worst defeat in American history. And what came next was even worse. On April 9th, the Japanese decided to move their 76,000 prisoners to a prison camp 55 miles away, on foot, virtually without food through the sweltering jungle. It became known as the Battan Death March, and with good reason. In 5 days of marching, some 10,000 men would die. One of the survivors was a 21-year-old Army Air Corps sergeant named Ralph Levenberg, and Ralph Levenberg is standing beside me now. The one thing that everyone says about the Battan Death March, who was there apparently from my reading, is that there's no way you can convey to anyone what it was like. Could you try with the one or two vivid images that stick out in your mind, in your memory?
I can say this, that there is no more traumatic experience that a human being can go through than the loss of one's freedom. You lose your family, you lose your fortune, you lose your house. You can lose almost anything, but when you lose your freedom, this is a trauma which is non-explainable in words.
Nothing prepares you for that.
No.
What about the brutality, the images of torture, the horrible fact that you came back, I think, weighing 72 pounds?
There's no way to really make people believe the atrocities that were perpetrated on the death march and throughout our prison imprisonment really is believable, because human beings just don't believe that other human beings can be this way.
Yeah.
On the march, for instance, one of the famous ones was to get us in front of an artesian well after we had had no water, and not allow us to have the water. And those who just couldn't resist would rush toward the wells, and they drank their last. They were either bayoneted or shot, or both.
Or beheaded in some
Or
cases.
beheaded in some instances.
What was the point of all this nightmare brutality?
I think the Japanese had, for eons, been referred to and looked upon as the little man in the world. Now they had the upper hand. Right now they had the upper hand, and they had become superior. They were not used to this type of situation. And also, we were not prisoners of war, per se. We were captives.
So you saw your colleagues starved, killed, ridden to death, underfed, horrible things. There's one image in your book when you were riding in a truck that you said sticks in your mind more than anything else, I think. You were crossing a road and there was something in the road.
Yes, this is the most vivid memory that I have of the Death March, and that is of the outline of a body in the road that had been driven over so many times by tanks and or trucks that it was just the outline of the body. And the memory that I have is that this thing was still reaching out, asking for help from us, and of course we couldn't do anything about it.
Can any of us who have only seen Hollywood movies have any image of what it was really like?
No, no. The movie that I recall that came closest to depicting what prison life under the Japanese was the bridge on the River Kwai. This was truly a one part of what happened while we were prisoners.
None of the John Wayne movies did it for you.
Not really.
Do you hate the Japanese as a race?
Oh, no. No, I have no animosity toward anyone because of his race or color or creed. I don't do anything to enhance the economy of the Japanese. I help build many of the factories that are there today. But,
ironic, isn't it?
But I don't. No, that would just, I think, worsen the emotional problems that we have.
I've heard that the bodies of the Battan Death March survivors would appear medically to be 20 years older than they actually are. That the body appears to be that of a man 15 to 20 years old.
I had an orthopedic surgeon tell me when I was 47 years old that I was in damn good shape for a man 67 years old. And I told him that I was only 47, and he smiled and he said, "Yes, I know, I read your record, but those of you who have gone through this malnutrition, this starvation, your bodies have aged between 10 and 20 years beyond your years." And it's true. Many of our people that we see each year at our convention, one that has just been completed last week, are men who look 90 years old who are 61 and 62. And it is true that some are still having difficulty convincing the Veterans Administration that this was caused by what I went through.
Thank you for making this credible story partly credible. We're being moved on.
I guess we better go.
Let's go. For America, this was the low point of World War II. But from then on, things began to improve. Just 9 days after the fall of Bataan, on April 18th, American bombers under the command of General James Doolittle attacked Tokyo. Taking off from an aircraft carrier, the planes staged the raid that the Japanese believed was impossible. Military damage to Tokyo was negligible, but the effect on morale was tremendous. Japan was shocked, and America was jubilant. 6 weeks later, on June 4th, Pearl Harbor was avenged. In what has been called the greatest naval victory in modern history, the U.S. Navy destroyed the heart of the Japanese fleet in the Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, all of which had launched planes against Pearl Harbor, were sunk, along with several other ships. Over 300 planes were shot down, and 3,500 enemy sailors were killed. The Americans lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and about 300 men. The victory at Midway turned the tide in the war against Japan. Our supply lines were now open, and soldiers and Marines could now begin their so-called island hopping toward the Japanese homeland. The first, and perhaps the bloodiest of these battles, came in August on a small island called Guadalcanal. The fighting would rage for over 6 months. Much of it hand-to-hand combat in jungles that were deadly even without bullets. The sick would outnumber the wounded, and nearly 5,000 Americans, most of them Marines, would die on the godforsaken island of Guadalcanal. The Japanese dead would total nearly 30,000. By Christmas, the island would be nearly secured. At least some of the Americans could now briefly relax in that steaming jungle and listen with bitter irony to the year's most popular song.
Of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know, where the treetops glisten and children listen to hear sleigh bells in the snow. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, with every Christmas card I write. May your days be merry and bright, and may all your Christmases be white.
Half a world away, the song was just as ironic. On November 7th, American troops under General Dwight David Eisenhower invaded North Africa, in the first American move against Hitler. The invasion was part of the attempt to drive German General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, from the shores of Africa. Actually, Rommel had already been stopped by British General Bernard Montgomery at the Battle of El Alamein. But it would be another 6 months before the combined British and American forces would finally free North Africa of the German army. In Germany itself, Hitler had finally made his decision to exterminate the Jews of Europe. His infamous concentration camps were being turned into death camps, in which some 6 million Jews and others would be murdered. In occupied Paris, some 30,000 Jews were rounded up on July 16th and sent to death camps. Of the 30,000 taken away, only 30 people would survive the war. Back at home in that year of 1942, America would have its own moment of shame. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were rounded up on the Pacific coast and thrown into internment camps. The camps were in no way death camps, but life in one was hardly pleasant. In addition to losing their freedom, the Japanese Americans also lost most of their property. Over $400 million worth was taken from them without any legal proceedings whatsoever. General John DeWitt, the man in charge of the roundup, explained it this way: a Jap's a Jap. It doesn't make any difference whether he's an American or not. A few years later, the internments would be called the worst violation of civil rights in American history. While it is certainly no excuse, the action did come while the Pacific coast was in a state of near panic. Rumors were rampant following Pearl Harbor, especially concerning air raids and even an invasion fleet. In February, there actually was an attack. A Japanese submarine surfaced off the coast of Santa Barbara and fired some 25 shells at an oil refinery. Most of the shells landed in an empty field and damage was slight. And just a few days later, the pre-dawn quiet of Los Angeles was shattered by the wailing of air raid sirens and the crack of anti-aircraft fire. What was reported as a large formation of enemy planes was supposedly attacking the city. For almost 2 hours, anti-aircraft guns fired some 1,500 rounds into the Los Angeles sky, which was actually quite empty. The only damage came from falling shell fragments which damaged structures and injured a few citizens. On the East Coast, the panic was far less, but the danger far more real. Packs of German U-boats were sailing the East Coast within easy sight of land, and sinking just about any American tanker they wanted to. By June, some 400 American ships had been sunk, many of them while civilians watched from the shore. But most of the sinkings came at night, while the slow-moving tankers were clearly outlined against the lights of American coastal cities. For some reason, authorities waited until mid-April before ordering a so-called dim-out of the lights in coastal areas. On shore, the dim-out was most noticeable in Manhattan as the Great White Way became the Great Dim Way. But entertainment glowed brighter in America than at any time since the Roaring '20s. There were several reasons. Most Americans were making more money than ever before, but there were fewer ways to spend it. With the onset of gasoline rationing, most people got an A sticker, which gave you all of 3 gallons a week. And with most planes and trains booked by the military, travel was out of the question. A lot of people just stayed home and listened to the radio. Their choices ranged from the comedy of Jack Benny to the home front advice of the First Lady, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. But staying at home usually meant eating at home, and with food, sugar, and coffee all rationed, dining out became increasingly attractive. And if you could get away with it, dining out might even provide some nice fringe benefits. And to top it all off, there was a kind of eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow we die philosophy, a philosophy that wasn't entirely inaccurate. So, from the Palladium in Hollywood to Roseland in New York, nightclubs and big bands were having their finest hour. And one of the swinginest of all places was New York's famous Stage Door Canteen. American servicemen were entertained by the top names in show business every night. Unfortunately, the nightclub boom was not without its price. On the night of November 28th, a more-than-capacity crowd of between 800 and 1,000 merrymakers jammed themselves into Boston's popular Coconut Grove nightclub. Midway through the evening, a busboy accidentally burned some decorative paper, and within minutes, the club was engulfed in flames. Nearly 500 patrons would be burned or trampled to death in the worst fire in recent American history. But in 1942, violent death was becoming commonplace, and the Boston fire did little to dampen America's enthusiasm for party time.
I want a zoot suit with the reed pleat, with the drape shape and the stuff cuff to look sharp enough to see my Sunday gal.
Wearing a rather indescribable creation called a zoot suit and doing a form of dance called jitterbugging, many youngsters were able to forget, for a moment, the harsh realities of the day. Fortunately, the zoot suit became one of the casualties of the war. All that material had to go into uniforms, and so did many of the zoot suiters themselves. Women's fashions, too, were affected by the shortage of materials. Frills went away, and skirts got shorter, and nobody seemed to mind. And a hit song of 1942 asked the obvious musical question.
Who wouldn't love you? Who wouldn't care? You're so enchanting, people must stare. You're the dream that dreamers want to dream about. You're the breath of spring that lovers gad about or mad about. Who wouldn't love you? Who wouldn't buy the west side of heaven if you just winked your eye? You're the answer to my every prayer, darling. Who wouldn't love you? Who wouldn't care?
When folks weren't bar crawling in 1942, it seemed that everyone was going to the movies. Even more than during the Great Depression, when movies were the great escape. Each and every week, an average of 85 million people went to a motion picture. That's 60% of the total population. It wasn't easy for Hollywood to keep up with the staggering demand. Because of their importance to morale, both at home and overseas, the movies were considered to be an essential war industry, meaning that draft deferments were available to certain workers. But most of them joined anyway. Clark Gable entered the Air Corps just 6 months after his wife Carol Lombard was killed in that plane crash. Tyrone Power enlisted as a private in the Marines while the battle was going on at Guadalcanal. Jimmy Stewart was in the Air Corps flight school on the way toward winning his wings, and years later Stewart would retire as a general. And not all the movie people who enlisted were stars. In 1942 alone, a total of 4,000 workers in the motion picture industry joined the armed forces. Almost every big-name entertainer who didn't join the service spent months every year performing at home and overseas for the servicemen. As a morale builder, the visits from the stars were considered to be almost as important as tanks or planes to the war effort. Despite the loss of talent on both sides of the camera, Hollywood kept cranking out its films. And perhaps one of the reasons that attendance was so high was that some of the pictures were true classics. Casablanca, with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, was perhaps the most enduring film of the decade. Bob Hope and Bing Crosby did what was probably the best of their road pictures in 1942, The Road to Morocco. Joseph Cotton and Anne Baxter starred in Orson Welles' film The Magnificent Ambersons. Fred Astaire and Bing Crosby sang the songs of Irving Berlin and Holiday Inn, and Crosby's recording of White Christmas remains the largest-selling single record ever released. Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake starred in the gangster classic This Gun for Hire, and the list goes on. And for the GIs overseas, the occasional opportunity to lose yourself in one of those films became as important as dry boots or a letter from home. Those letters, incidentally, came in the form of something called V-mail. That's V as in victory. V-mail. That refers to letters that were censored and then photographed and reduced in size so that more could be sent in less space. And just sorting the millions of letters that went to troops overseas every day became a major task for the armed forces, and V-mail letters like this made the job a lot easier. Just one of the small wonders of 1942. It was a year in which America was infused with the excitement of war. An excitement that would turn to fear and pain and grim determination as the war ground on through the years ahead.